Welcome to today's episode of Comms Business Live, where we're joined by David Williams, Group Commercial Director at Gamma, to talk about the Telecommunications Security Act 2021, which requires telecoms providers to ensure their networks are secure and resilient. In this session, we're going to discuss the following: why the Telecoms Security Act was brought in, what the Act means for the channel, the key challenges involved in complying with it, the consequences if channel partners fail to comply with it, and what companies need to do to comply with it. So first off, David, could I just ask you to explain a little bit about the Telecoms Security Act and why it was brought in initially and how it works in practice?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. I know this is an exciting topic, so I'll cover it in a bit of detail, but equally, if you've got any sort of questions or clarifications, do stop me mid-flight. So in terms of why the Telecom Security Act was brought in, it was an act introduced by the government because of a response to a growing cyber threat landscape, including, I guess, the threat of sophisticated attacks from nation states, including other malicious actors in the UK's critical national infrastructure. I think it's a recognition, really, of the complexity in the UK comms supply chain, and was really designed to try and up the level of threat awareness within industry. The Act itself it received royal assent in November 21, came into force October 22. It's actually, if you like, a multifaceted, layered framework. So it starts with primary legislation, which is amendment to the Comms Act, which is what happened in 2022, and then it goes into specific security measures, which we talk about as being requirements, which came into force in 2022, which if you like, remain current is the intent, and can be amended by the Secretary of State. And in fact, Alex, a couple of days ago, there was a consultation set out by government to do just that, really ensure that the requirements that we're all working to are current, which sort of brings in things like eSIMs and other sort of newer functionality, which has come out since the original draft was published. And then, in addition to, so you have the Act, you have the security measures as part of the regulations, and the regulations are secondary legislation. Then you also have this technical guidance, which is the code of practice, and that, if you like, details the guidelines to which the providers of networks and services to the public are to comply with their duties under the Act. Stop me at any point if this isn't making sense, by the way. So then you I guess, have Ofcom involved. Ofcom's involvement in this is really to act as the UK's telecoms regulator, to oversee and enforce compliance against the Act. So they were given at the same time new powers to monitor providers, conduct technical tests, and also impose penalties for non-compliance. So Ofcom has also published additional procedural guidance and also resilience guidance, which it then uses itself to monitor providers in their technical security audits. The Ofcom audits themselves, and this is you hear about the concept of tiers in industry around the Telecom Security Act. That there's three tiers of provider in the Act. You have tier one providers whose turnover to Ofcom is £1 billion per year. You have tier two providers, which is 50 million to £1 billion, which is where Gamma sits sort of in the middle of. And then you have tier three providers, which is less than 50 million relevant turnover a year. When I say relevant turnover, this is the turnover that providers have to provide to Ofcom every year, and it forms the basis of your Ofcom fees. And if you like, the Ofcom level of oversight is the highest, which would make sense on the tier one, the biggest providers. But they actually have a regular audit program on both tier two and tier one providers. So there's a common misconception, certainly around the channel, that the Telecom Security Act doesn't apply unless you're a tier one or tier two provider. Whereas in reality, the Act applies to everybody, the Ofcom audits apply only to the tier 1 and tier 2 providers.
Right, I see. And what does this really mean for the channel and its customers? How many is it likely to impact?
Sure. So the Act goes into lots of detail around effectively securing networks and services. And when I say networks and services, what I'm talking about there is a public electronic communications network and the services over which that run over that network. So if you like, the PEC-N is the underlying physical layer of network and technology that allows for communication, and then a PEC-S is the service that the customer signs up for that runs over the top. So for most of our partners in the channel, they are reselling, if you like, a Gamma PEC-S, whether that's WebEx or IPEX or whatever. So Gamma as the network provider and the controller, if you like, of that service has lots of governance requirements around making sure that they are secure and are audited, and all the things you might expect. In fact, there's 258 controls that Gamma has to apply under the Telecoms Security Act, which when you overlay that to our products and services, we actually have 32 different variants, which actually creates Gamma some 8,256 controls that we have across our network. The partners, if you like, benefit from Gamma's economies of scale in that area. But there's a couple of places where the Act, if you like, goes out to a switchless reseller. Number one is there's a requirement if you're in a tiers 1 or 2, which is 50 million turnover or above, to have an understanding of the quality of your supply chain and the controls over which your supply chain have over their services. So if you're in that category, you are required to ensure that your supply chain is compliant. So that's number one. Number two will be if you're providing devices to a customer, routers, for example, they actually extend the network edge of Gamma. So the concept is that Gamma's network's boundary is basically the router of every individual broadband line, same as BT, same as everybody else. And therefore the requirement for those routers to be kept up to date is critical, particularly if they're third party supplied. And then the third requirement is that lots of our partners have created really interesting and powerful sort of add-ons, if you like, to services. And those add-ons can be in theory sold to other providers. So even if you are a tier 3 provider with a widget which is provided to a tier 2 or tier 1 provider, by virtue of you being effectively a supplier to their networks, you are brought into scope of their requirements. So if you're a tier 3 provider that's supplying a widget to BT, for example, you are immediately considered to be a tier 1 supplier to BT, which creates complexity, arguably, and cost. And then finally, this isn't particularly a change, but there's obligations under the Comms Act to report security incidents and outages. So any provider that has a security incident, there's different tolerances, but the key one that sort of keeps everyone awake at night is an outage for an hour or more that affects 1,000 customers. It affects their ability to dial 999 is a reportable outage, whether you're Gamma or the partner. So they're the main ones.
Okay. What would you say are the key challenges involved in complying with the Act?
Well, as you've probably gathered, it's very complex, and it's complex not through design, but just because it's a nuanced area. It's also very wide-ranging and legally nuanced. I said already about the thousands of control measures that we've had to put in. All of these things make it a multi-year project, and there's lots and lots of requirements and deadlines that fall in that multi-year project. So effectively, Gamma, for example, has put a multi-year, multi-million-pound investment wrap around all of this, both in terms of capex and opex. The most difficult thing if you're providing your own infrastructure of whatever size is understanding how any legacy systems and infrastructure can be brought up to speed and modernized. So effectively, it becomes part of your sort of asset control proceedings as a business. Is, you need to take a view on what priorities you have in terms of what infrastructure and how to upgrade and update, which of course has its own financial burden and financial strain on operators, which is not, in this day and age, those costs are substantial and largely, unbudgeted for in lots of cases. I think that there is the biggest challenge for any provider is really to make sure they have a plan. I think it's a classic: if you fail to plan to fail. I think having a plan and then acting on that plan, and with that plan identifying the key areas of risk for each individual business is really critical. Not just from a sort of outside audit looking in, but also from just a resource prioritization for every provider. And certainly what we've found, and I suspect what our partners are finding, is actually the management of a supply chain, which is a sort of, Microsoft as an example, big US providers are not going to sort of fill in your supplier questionnaires to a level that you might want. So you have to manage suppliers, but also take a sort of considered view on some of the responses. So you do what you can, but be realistic as to where you can influence and take informed decisions as a result.
Right. Okay. And what happens if channel partners fail to comply with the new legislation? What are the consequences?
My audit team asked me this question, and I have to tell them it's 10% of your annual turnover, or 100,000 a day is the limit of a fine. But I think in practice, the more likely issues are probably lower numbers, but probably equally impactful. So in lots of contracts, obviously we all say we'll comply with law and regulation. This becomes a bit of an issue if you're not compliant with the Telecoms Security Act. And by the way, compliance, lots of providers are on a journey towards compliance, which is why I'm saying about this plan. I don't think anyone is saying that they're fully compliant with all the areas. It's more around making sure you're aware of the risks and understand how you're going to be compliant in a period of time. Of course, there's reputational damage that could arise if there are issues. I think that, and it's not happened yet, but it could happen, that there could be a scenario where the large tier one providers almost sort of consider themselves to be kite marked to a degree, so that they have a kind of economies of scale benefit by playing compliance as a strength against smaller providers. There's no talk of a kite mark for this, but clearly the investment required and the security becomes a sales opportunity for large providers over partners and over Gamma. And I think that there's potential issues on partners' business valuations. So it becomes a bit of a, the warranties and nothing else, all the things that you'd have to sort of do to show to a buyer that you are a forward-looking, credible business. If you don't have a story under the Telecoms Security Act, backed by a plan and backed by evidenced, considered approaches, then it starts to sort of, buyers start to form view, I would say. Okay.
And just finally, what practical steps can companies take to really ensure that they comply with the Act?
Well, I think it's probably going back to the planning point. The first step is just understanding your position. So a general assessment of what your compliance expectations are and how they're flowing, how you can flow them to your suppliers as needed, and where your vulnerabilities might be in terms of the products you're constructing yourselves, those PEC-S and PEC-N components. I would say probably that then follows a gap analysis of the security measures versus what you have in your network. There's the key thing for Gamma was understanding in detail what our security critical functions are, and then the functions that provide oversight to those. So effectively, that's saying if a component of the network were to go down, what would be the impact, and what do we have monitoring for that going down, such that we can identify problems and take action. So anyone with a network of any size I would certainly look there first. We developed a compliance roadmap. this is really critical, because in any business you need to get budget assigned to the journey. So effectively that becomes almost effectively like a budgetary milestoned allocation of resource, if you like, plan, along with the project management wrap. And then I think it's more around sort of investing in expertise and technology where needed against that budget. And then you get into the, if you like, the ongoing monitoring and review of controls and contracts and governance. Lots of these things I think you can overlay into your ISO requirements, trying to find synergies of what you're doing as a business already to sort of feather into these requirements, because they're all good. But if you try and create individual controls for individual sort of Telecoms Security Act, ISOs, etc., I think you need to try and find synergies that overlay.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for your time today, David, and thank you everyone for listening.